Go ahead, Nate.
Helps if I turn my microphone on. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully we won't have too many technical issues today, and hopefully we'll start off on a good foot. I want to talk about land access rights and knowing your rights, because I think one of the problems with property is we all think about which property we own. Who owns this property? Who owns that property? But if you can't access your property, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good just to own it. So want to share some stories and share some experiences that I've had over my time of working in the land industry, and point out some of the key issues that you need to be concerned about and be thinking about beyond just land. You're managing your land and owning your land. So knowing your rights is very important. If you don't know your rights, you may not actually have them. A good example of this is there was a family that had a cabin, a house along a forest road, and they had the public was going through and tearing up the road because it was a dirt road, and they were making potholes and making the road almost unpassable. So they requested to be able to close the road to public access, and it wasn't a county road. It was actually owned by a private forest company, and they were denied. They could not maintain the road. They didn't have any rights to maintain the road. They didn't have any rights to close the road. And all they could do is use the road in whatever condition it was. So when they bought the place, they clearly didn't understand their access rights or lack of access rights. And they had to live with the road that was almost unpassable. So technology, just a second, I need to get my slideshow to go to the next page. Just a second, I'm going to relaunch my slideshow. Sorry, I am having technical difficulties trying to get my slideshow to progress. So let's see if I can launch it a different way. So I will launch it this way and then just stick it into presentation mode. Okay, doesn't want to. Oh, there we go.
There you go. Yeah, I was going to say, success.
So, yes. So what access rights do you have? You may have state, federal, county roads. You might have owned or granted reserved easements. You could have historic or prescribed easements, and you may have limitations in your access. Understanding every aspect of this is critical. On to the next slide, where you have complications of access. There was a time where I was working on a project where we had several federal agencies. So you had Forest Service, a BLM, school trust lands, state parks, private ownership, and everybody was using the same road, and they all had access to use this road, with one caveat: there was a bridge, and the state engineer determined that the bridge was no longer a feasible bridge and no longer usable, and it needed to be replaced. So then became the question of who owned the bridge and who had the rights to replace the bridge. And it didn't matter who were the users, it mattered who owned the bridge. And the entity that had the right to replace the bridge didn't necessarily want to replace it, or didn't want to change the bridge, or was limited in what they were wanting to do. And so everyone's access was limited based on who owned the bridge. And I've seen cases where bridges have been closed and all access have been cut off temporarily until that entity that owned the bridge was willing to replace it, repair it, or decide what they want to do with it. So sometimes just because you have a road there or you have access, even if if you have an easement on it, if you don't have the right to repair it and to maintain it, you may not have sufficient access. The other issue that I've found was there was another similar case where the road snaked through multiple federal agencies, multiple private parties, and it was a dirt road or a gravel road, and the Forest Service owned part of the road, but it was 10, 15 miles off the county road where their ownership began. And then it went through partially Forest Service, then it went through public, or then it went through like state land, then it went through private land, then it went back to the Forest Service. And who was responsible for actually grading the road, maintaining that road? It wasn't a county road, so every property owner had to maintain their section of road until they could come to a road maintenance agreement where everybody chipped in and they maintained the entire road. And sometimes I've seen these work and sometimes I have seen them not work. So sometimes you get some really strange, this person's responsible for this mile, another person's responsible for a quarter mile, and it becomes sort of a mess with using the roads. Another case, there was a county road that was clearly documented on public record, but had been abandoned in terms of use. The county road easement still existed. It was still a documented county road, but there were 6 to 8 inch trees growing throughout the whole entire course of the roadway where the easement was. And so probably 50, 60 years earlier, they had realigned the road and gone and taken it along a different path. However, they missed recording the documentation of the new roadway. And so it was not clearly a county road. So the property owner, halfway down the county road, decided to put a gate on the county road, on the newly developed road, because they decided that they wanted their little section of land, they wanted to put a little hotel, hunting cabins, and they didn't like everyone just driving through their property, even though there was a county road going through their property. So they gated it, and because the county didn't have it documented that they owned that road or they developed that road, then the only way to get access through that gate was to go through a court case, and the only way to use the old county road was to cut down all the trees and to actually build a county road where the actual easement was. And that just ended up in court and never really got resolved. But it shows you the importance of making sure you're recording your easements, making sure you're recording the documents. And just because it's known to be public doesn't actually necessarily make it public. And if there's any questions, it just equals lawsuits. Challenges to legal access. I was working on a fairly large property in Montana called Fish Creek. It's near Missoula, just west of Missoula. And this is a fairly simple map of it, where you have a federal freeway, you have state highways, that's a gravel road. The one that goes north and south is a gravel state highway that's open most of the year, closed partially. It has a few seasonal closures. There are, some of these roads have over 8 right-of-ways and easements crossing them. And some of these roads, even with all those easements, are next to impassable at parts of the year because of how this does not show your elevation and your terrain that it's going through. And some of them just are not worth maintaining by any party. So it becomes a little bit of a muddy mess and a nightmare to actually get through. This area also has that same problem with bridges and limitations of the width of use and the access issues. Further to complicate this, a lot of this property was bought using federal funds that had tax implications on them, using Pittman-Robinson dollars or the like, where now that the land was acquired with some tax restrictions on it, anytime you wanted to improve it or change anything, let's say you needed to widen the road or you needed to do road work to replace the bridge in a very complicated area, you may or may not have the right to do that, or it became extremely complex to do it. And it adds just a lot of expense and time to managing this project. So sometimes understanding your rights is understanding what rights you have, what rights you don't have, and what rights other people have. And any restrictions on the property, whether it's via deed or via encumbrances that could have been funding encumbrances, it can become a fairly tricky situation. And I would say the next thing that really, another change that we're seeing that I'm concerned about is the current change in the government thinking about public purpose, multi-purpose doctrine that went into place back in the 70s and has been sort of the way we manage federal lands, to a major focus on conservation, where you're looking at 30% conservation initiatives across the US. And when you look at, let's see, when you look at federal lands across the US and you start thinking 30%, if you take 30% of this and add it to conservation and begin to do conservation easements or access agreements on this, you're going to cut off a lot more than 30% of the property. And there's where my concern lies. All you have to do is cut off the access. And if you cut off the access, you may be conserving, you look at a state like Nevada, you might actually, I mean, sure, if you want to drive 100 miles around on roads that are dangerous for your tires to drive on, then yeah, you have access, but you don't have an easy, usable access that is reasonable. So every time they're starting to talk about conservation measures, you need to be thinking about access, right-of-ways, and ability to replace bridges, improve roads, and actually get access to the property. Another issue that's come up fairly recently, it's not a new issue, it's been coming up for the last 150 or so years, but it has come up a lot recently, is corner crossing. Below on this yellow checkerboard map, you can see the yellow is representing the BLM, blue is representing state lands and school trust lands probably, and the clear is private interest. And to go from corner to corner, that is what we would call corner crossing. This has been in and out of the courts for the last 150 years in terms of access and who has rights and who doesn't have rights. The current case was dealing with hunters who were trying to access public lands because according to the law, you cannot deny access to public lands by a corner crossing. From the landowner's perspective, they feel like they have exclusive use of the lands and they feel like they're they could be losing value to their property because they feel like they control access to the public lands. And according to various cases that have come through, that the Supreme Court's even ruled that fences obstructing access to public lands, even if they're on private property, are violating the public right to access the property, to access public lands. This corner crossing issue directly impacts over 8.3 million acres of public land, but I would suggest that it impacts significantly more than that, because it could be impacting, if you look, let me just go up a couple slides. If you look in Nevada along the I-80 corridor, where it's that white line going through the northern part of the state, if you can cut off access from the freeway via corner crossing, you may not be able to access or get across to public lands that are just outside of the, just beyond the private lands. So it could be cutting off definitely more than 8.3 million acres. So in summary, my presentation may be a bit short today, but I would say in summary, it's really important to know your access rights, to know your liabilities, to know your limitations, and to where you can to map them. As I mentioned, up in Fish Creek, we had over 8 different easements that were stacked, and they all had different rights. What that meant is there were some roads we couldn't close, even though we wanted to close them, because other people had rights of use. And so sometimes what you need to do is you need to be able to take that back to the negotiation table and see if you can find a different access that can be used, that is a better access, and ensure that it is documented, that it is recorded, that it is available publicly. So if it's ever challenged in the future, that it's cleaned up. I would say access tends to be one of those things that people forget about. They assume that they have it. They don't necessarily bother recording it. And all of a sudden you have a road running through everyone's property and everyone thinks that, oh, it must be a county road. I think I have the right to use it. And it's always one to verify. Check, do you have the easements? Do you have the right-of-ways? Do you have access? Do you have all of the access that you need? Is it limited? And what happens if you lose it? If that is your only access to the property, do you lose the right to access your property? What is the likelihood of loss? And these are always questions that you need to look at, review, understand. You might have a great road to your place, but if you don't have access, if you can't actually use it, if you can't use it to the extent that you need to, you might actually not have very sufficient access. And it's one of those property issues that may impact the use of your property, and it's a significant risk. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm always open for questions and discussions. As Mike mentioned, I have worked with both public entities on access rights, worked with mining companies, worked with private owners that were looking to get access across historic prescribed easements. I've dealt with, another story is my great grandpa had a beautiful piece of land in Montana, and the access to it was limited to when parts of the year he could access the property when the river was low enough. He could go across the slough and drive across. They had a road built across it when the water was low enough. However, when the Flathead Dam went in, it raised the height of Flathead Lake enough that his property, the slough, was always wet, and he no longer could drive across it. And back when they did that, they probably didn't have any recourse to go and regain access in a different way or get compensation for it. So they never really gained drivable access to the property, and all they could do is they could get access to the property by crossing neighbors or by river access. But he had a beautiful, very valuable piece of property. However, he couldn't actually access it to develop. So, well, it was about a 100-acre hillside property overlooking the Flathead Valley and Flathead Lake, with access to the Flathead River. But without sufficient access, there was no way you could build a house up there or a subdivision or anything else. And a property that could have been worth tens of millions of dollars was not, because of the access issues. Right downstream from that, or downriver from that, right before you get to Flathead Lake, there's a bridge called Sportsman's Bridge. And in my lifetime, it's been replaced at least twice, but currently it is so developed around it that it's difficult for anybody to actually do anything with this property, or to expand the bridge or to change the course of the bridge, because you have fishing access sites on one side, private ownership tucked into the other side. You have conservation easements around the property, and it is taking the state a significant amount of time to figure out the fix of how to improve this bridge, of how to replace the bridge, of how to widen the bridge, simply because of lack of space and because of all the competing interest around it. And they can't necessarily condemn state land or federal land or encumbered land. So it becomes a place of negotiation, and that they have to work from there. So any questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Nate. I appreciate that. Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Nate, if you could post those into the Q&A, and then we will review any of those when we have our Q&A session in about an hour's time.